8-year data workshop, and welcome to those who are online today. We've got a few people in our live audience, which is slightly weird, but I think we have a number of people who are zooming in, so welcome to those of you online as well. Today we're going to follow up our report release from yesterday. I hope many of you were able to attend that, because that will have given you a really good context for what we're going to be talking about today. Today it will be me again, but not for too long, followed by Avinesh Piliai, who is our head biostatistician, and he's going to be doing most of the work today. He will be telling you all about the data sets that are there at 8, talking about the technical documentation that sits alongside that, and basically introducing you to the data sets that are available, and we hope enthusing you about the opportunities that exist to engage with this data set and answer your research questions. So here's just a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. We want to talk about the study itself, because data on its own is meaningless unless you know the context, so we'll just give you a brief review of the study context, not so much from the report that hopefully you will have engaged with or seen some of the release of, but actually some of the technical details about how the study was established and what it was established to achieve, because those things are really important when we start to think about the research opportunities there are in engaging with the data set. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on that. And then we'll move to Avinesh, who will take you through some of the more technical aspects of the data sets, talking about where the data is, how it's stored, all of the documentation that is alongside those data sets to actually assist you with engaging with the data. And then he'll also take you through how you apply for those data sets if you decide that there is a research question that you would like to answer. And believe me, there are probably thousands, if not millions, of questions. And we will have time at the end for questions. So if you have any that aren't burning, please hold on to them till then, and Avinesh and I or others will help you answer those. If you have any points of clarification as we go through, please just feel free to raise your hand, or if you're online, to go through the chat function, and then we can answer those questions as we go through, just in terms of clarification, or even parking them if they are something that seems more general. So, growing up in New Zealand is a longitudinal study. There's no surprises there, hopefully, for anybody in the room or online, because that would be sad. We have set out to follow the development of children growing up in New Zealand today, in the 21st century. It's been designed from the beginning to understand what shapes development across a normal population of children, so that's our population of interest, is all current births. So every time we think about a research question, we are thinking about those children being at the centre of that research question, even though we also ask about their families and their wider environments. This study is about those children. And we have followed them through since before they were born, because we recognise how important that perinatal period is for shaping their development as well. So these are the research objectives that were set out at the beginning of the study. They were important in terms of the design of what we did and all of the data that we've collected so far. So every time we go out to the field, including the 8-year, we are collecting information from the children and their families to allow us to answer these sorts of questions. And there are more detailed questions that you'll be able to find actually at the back of the report and on our website. So each domain, so there are 6 domains of wellbeing and development that we look at for our children that I'll talk about shortly, but there are specific questions under those. But these are our 5 overarching questions, and basically whenever we're thinking about what research is appropriate for this study, these are the sorts of questions that your research question should fit underneath. So basically the thing about this is we're looking at trajectories, we're looking at change over time. This is not a study that is designed to understand prevalence at a particular point in time, although we do sometimes extrapolate from the information about how that applies to children of similar ages. But the key thing is that we're looking at what shapes wellbeing over time, what is influencing development, and importantly right now, what's influencing wellbeing. So I should have just said before I start, because I see some of you writing these things down, We will make these slides available, so please don't feel you have to take notes on these slides, but obviously you're welcome to take additional notes. We will also make a recording of this session available so that people can go back and actually listen again if you want to. And as well as that, we will also have an opportunity for people to come and use our data access website to ask more specific questions. I was talking to Avinesh before and just want to let you know that we have a range of users who have signed up for this workshop. Some of you in this room are quite experienced at using the data sets. Others I know won't have engaged with them before, similarly those online. So we're going to pitch this somewhere in the middle today, and you may well want to come back and ask more questions, and that's absolutely fine. So we'll make these things available for you to help you to do that. Okay. So this is the next sort of step beyond what are we trying to achieve with this study. We set up our conceptual framework for this study back in 2006, so quite a while ago now. And we call it our double puddle model affectionately. It's kind of, I guess, a cartoon that helps us to understand all of the things that we're collecting over time. It's a double puddle because we're not just interested at one point in time, as I just said, but we're interested in change over time. And in the middle of those concentric circles or ovals, we have the children. They are the key participants in this study. So everything that we do is related to those children. And our results or our data sets are generalisable to those children at that particular age and that group of children who were born at that time in New Zealand. So if you're thinking about questions, for example, that are about their parents or their families, it's not a generalisable study for parents or for families. It's about the children. We're tracking them as the central participants in this study. It's absolutely multidisciplinary, which is one of its strengths, I think, but also its challenges. So we're collecting information across a large number of domains, and we really try and balance that out every time we go into the field to collect information about what shapes well-being, but also about well-being outcomes. And interestingly, as I'm sure you know, in a longitudinal study, an outcome at one point becomes a determinant of later outcomes. So it's not easy to define what's an exposure and what's an outcome when you're thinking over time. We're really interested, as you'll see in this figure, I hope, with all these little black arrows that sit on that figure, about the dynamic interaction of children with their environments. Not just children as passive recipients of what's going on around them, but actually thinking about how children are engaging and impacted by the things that are going on around them. So those are really important things to consider as you're thinking about measures over time. How much of this is about what's innate to the child? How much of what we're seeing is about changes in the environment that are then reflected in what is happening in the children and their families. So that's what those little arrows describe, and you can see they exist at every level, from the outside layer, which is a political layer, right into the children, and the closest circle is their family, and then we move out into the informal and formal society. So things like education fits into that formal society, for example. And there's neighbourhoods and communities in the middle. There's lots of layers to think about that these children are engaging with. Interestingly, when we started this was kind of a diagram, I guess, that was about, rather than a virtual, it was more about sort of geographical closeness or proximity for children. Now we need to also be layering in connectivity for these children at a virtual level. So some of their communities and environments may actually not be close to them physically, but they may be close to those people. So over time, this is getting more and more complex, actually, and as you engage with the data sets, we hope you will be aware of those things and start thinking about those things as well. It is what you might have heard referred to as a socio-ecological model or a social determinants model. We think about well-being of children in terms of those broader determinants, sometimes called a systems approach to thinking about well-being. So it's not just about risk factors and outcomes, it's trying to understand what is shaping pathways or journeys of these children over time. I guess what's exciting about the 8-year that you're going to hear about today is it's an opportunity to hear from the children directly. And that's one of the things that's exciting about this study. Because obviously in the first few years, we are reliant on the parents to tell us about what's going on for their children, what's going on in their environments, and so on. But at 8, the children were able to speak for themselves. So not necessarily with all of the information, it's a beginning, not the end, but it's still really important. So we actually have a child voice now at 8, which is wonderful, but also adds complexity when you start thinking about the sort of broad or the breadth of the data that is available at 8, and we'll talk about that a wee bit more as we run through. Perhaps one of the other things that I just want to highlight about this set of data, this set of information that we get from the children and the families, is that it's not just about looking at what goes wrong. This sort of information that we collect is also trying to understand what is working for these families. And again, that direct voice, that direct contact allows us to look at those things. So strengths-based approaches, an approach that can consider, for example, te ao Māori lens, which is a really important issue in New Zealand when we think about some of the statistics that are available for our well-being of children. So this study offers a chance with a smaller group than the whole population, but nevertheless a group that is broadly generalisable, to start to explore some of these things in depth that we can't do with routine statistics. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of questions that might be valuable to ask. So just a really quick summary of what the cohort looked like when we started. Some of you will know this well, but let me just give you a quick overview. 6,853 children at recruitment. That was a potential cohort. They were recruited via their pregnant mums, so in pregnancy. Towards the end of pregnancy, we aimed for around about 28 weeks, but some came earlier, some later, some births were earlier than intended, so there are a few hundred who actually we interviewed postnatally because those babies were born before we could get to the mums. So you need to be aware of that. There's a variable that will tell you that if you go right back to the perinatal data set. Quite important to understand, and a slightly reduced set of questions that we asked of those mums. The idea of going in pregnancy was to avoid recall bias once the child was actually born. So for those few hundred who actually had their interviews after their baby was born, because they came earlier than expected usually, or because we couldn't reach mum before, you need to be aware that they won't have that complete data because of those issues with quality and completeness. We also recruited the partners, and that was quite novel in a study like this. So we recruited the dads mostly, or the partners of the mums in pregnancy. And we did that because they were likely to be influencing the children's well-being as well. It was about the social environment that those children were exposed to, or likely to be exposed to once they were born. Most of those dads, and not every mum, gave us a contact for a partner or a dad, but most of those partners, I should say, told us they were the biological dad. Now, we didn't question that, okay? So 99% said they were the biological dad, so let's hope that's the case. But that's how we started. That's not necessarily how we've continued. And we'll talk about that a bit more, and I'm sure Avinesh will go into that as well. The children themselves, we didn't actually know about when we recruited the mums and dads. The children weren't a cohort until around about the 9-month data collection wave. They were just a virtual group of births. Lots of things can happen in late pregnancy in that first neonatal period, up to 1 month or even beyond. And there were some children, unfortunately, and parents who had adverse events that meant that they did not continue in the study. So it wasn't until 9 months that we actually had the children as the key participants in this study. And that's something that sometimes catches people out when they're looking at the data sets. Really, the children and the ability to track trajectories starts at that point, and the information we have about their parents in the perinatal period gives us that context, but it's not a study of those parents. And actually, really importantly, the children don't change over time, but the parents can. So just watch out for that if you're using the data, and Avinesh will tell you about how we work that out. Obviously, they have different ID numbers, which is great. They also have a family code, which will help to link them up, but they may not be the same mum and dad over time, but it will be the same children. So just watch out for that sort of process as well. As I said earlier, one of the things, again, that is really important about this study is that we have a diversity of children on board. So before they were born, we asked their mums and their dads about what they thought, I guess, their children would think about their ethnicity. So we asked them to tell us how they thought their children would identify themselves as they grew up. And what we started with is that 1 in 4 of the mums told us that they thought their children would identify as Māori, 1 in 5 is Pacific, 1 in 6 is Asian. And around about half said they thought they would have more than one ethnic group. So this is the mums. This is before the children were born. We asked the dads, they don't always agree. So if you're looking at that data and you're looking for a variable that tells you about that, don't expect that those are the same, because mums and dads didn't always agree about that. And now that we've asked the children at 8, they don't agree either. So just be really careful about using those sorts of variables that you think might be constant and not change, but actually over time they do. And actually that's what's really exciting about this, is tracking what's changed and potentially what that means for well-being and development. So that's how we started off. That proportion of births was representative at the time of the diversity, according to ethnicity, of all the births happening in New Zealand. It's not representative of the population. This is births that we were trying to be generalisable to. So sometimes people think we oversampled for particular groups. We didn't. We were trying to get a sample that was broadly generalisable to births, not to the population generally, which has a different mix of ethnicities in it. As well as that, we also have a mix of socioeconomic status. So when we look at deprivation, back when it was DEP 2006, then we actually saw that the distribution of the families across the deprivation quintiles or deciles mirrored the sort of distribution that we expected for families with young children right across the country. Now, saying that, the recruitment did take place in a geographical region. And sometimes this is kind of confused with it being an Auckland study. It's not just an Auckland study. It was a study that had a lot of its births in Auckland, the greater Auckland area, but it also had a lot of births in South Auckland and the Waikato. So we used those 3 broad DHB areas to recruit from. And that was a logistical decision. Trying to recruit right across the country when there's no record of births until after birth is not really a happening thing. So we had to choose areas that would allow us to get a cohort that we thought on these 2 variables, ethnicity and socioeconomic status, would give us a cohort that was broadly generalisable right across all births in New Zealand. And this group of DHBs, these 3 DHBs, have 33% of all of our births anyway. We initially wanted to have the North Shore or Waitemata as well, but unfortunately as many things happen in studies like this, you can't always do everything you want to do. So we just had to make some decisions about that. So that's really important things to think about. The children have moved. If any of you have seen the report, or the reports actually, the children have moved all over New Zealand now. 10% of them have moved overseas, certainly when we saw them last time. So there is a variable that will tell you where these children are. They're not all in those regions anymore, although the majority are. So that's something to be aware of as well. As well as recruiting this cohort, obviously retaining them is really, really important. And I'll show you a slide in a minute that will take you through the retention rates over time. It's really important when you're thinking about a research question to understand what your denominator is and how there may have been attrition over time and how that may impact on the sorts of questions you want to ask and the sorts of results that you get. So I'll talk you through that shortly. The retention rates for growing up in New Zealand have been high internationally, but we still would like them to be higher the next time we go out and see the children. So 81% is where we got to for the eligible cohort at 8. It had been above 90% before that. So we'd like it to push back towards 90%, even though we set this up expecting there would be 20% attrition in the first 2 years. So it was designed with that in mind. Okay, here's a little cartoon just to describe all of the data sets that we've now collected up to 8 years, up to and including 8 years. And we're going to be focusing on the 8 years today. This is a simplified version of the one we normally put up with all of the different graphics on it, because some of the phones and some of the measurements that we were using on that are now not really relevant when we start to think about how we communicate with each other. So we've changed them to green dots if you've seen this before in other ways. There are always multiple respondents when we go out to field. So there's mums and the partners or the dads. We haven't been able to connect with the dads at 4.5. We had a separate collection with the dads funded separately at 6. We're hoping that we'll see the dads at 11, but we didn't see them at 8. So there's information from mum and there's information from the children. And as I said, for the first time at 8, there's also information from the children answering their own questionnaires. So that's important. We also do some other things, some of the things that aren't available as yet, but we hope are being prepared, and those are we collect biological samples. Those are collected and safely stored away, we hope, in minus 80-degree freezers, but still needing to be explored in terms of all of the information that is sitting there. So that requires additional resourcing to do that, and we hope that will be available over time. Similarly, we get consent from parents to link to routine data sets. Now, that doesn't happen automatically, that also requires a process to go through. So some of those early linkages have now been incorporated into the data sets that you'll see, but some of the ones that we've just got consent for at 8 need a bit more work before those things are incorporated. So feel free to ask us about those things. We use a range of methods. We try and make sure we're collecting consistent information over time, but obviously there are some mixed modes that mean that you might want to think about where information is coming from, both in terms of respondents, but also the mode of collecting that data. Okay, here's the kind of Kite diagram, the diagram that talks to the sorts of information that every time we go to the field, we collect from these families. So this is the multidisciplinary sort of information that we're collecting. The vertical bars talk about all the different domains of influence that we're interested in, and we also have our themes with the 4 main ethnic groups in New Zealand. But actually we know we've got 60 plus ethnic groups in our cohort. These are the 4 main ones, and we only have power to look at those groups if we want to stratify on that variable. The other groups are too small, and we did not set out to deliberately be able to look at those groups with enough statistical power to explore some of those research questions in the smaller groups. Nevertheless, you'll be able to see those groups and start to understand what's happening for them. But these are the 4 groups we set out to be able to address research questions that were related to them. Importantly, when we design the questionnaires or the tools that we're going to use in the field, we want to make sure that they are addressing each of these domains and getting up-to-date age-specific and stage-specific information from the children and their families. But we also want to make sure that they're going to work these tools across this diverse cohort. So it's always a process of trying to use validated tools, and you'll see a lot of information about the tools that we've used and where they've come from. But often they've been validated outside of a New Zealand context. So the tool may be being used for the first time in our Māori and Pacific children, for example, when we use it in the field. We do some pre-testing. We also have a leading light group that we check all of the processes with before we go to our main cohort. Nevertheless, it's not a full psychometric testing prior to going to field. We try and actually do as much as we can, but that would be years of work often rather than a few months, so just so you're aware of that. But we try and give you all the references for those tools so that you can then understand where they've come from. And every time we think about what we measure, this is kind of a little cartoon again, just to take you through some of the decisions, because it takes us about 18 months or so to go from thinking about what do we want to achieve the next time we go to field. So we're thinking about 11 to 12 years at the moment, for example. We talk to a lot of our policy agencies, we talk to a lot of our experts, our scientific experts, our domain experts, and we try and work out what are the priorities here and now that will actually add value to the information we've had before, and that will actually then provide a platform for what we might want to ask as the children grow up later. And I guess there are a couple of things to just say about the data that we collect, because these are some of the things or some of the questions that we sometimes get. This is not a study that goes out with the same set of questions every time we go to the cohort and asks a whole lot of repeated questions. Every time we are looking at the questions to ask, we are thinking about the age-specific questions. And when you're thinking about children growing up, you have to use different tools at 2 than you used at 6 or at 8. There are very few tools, maybe other than the SDQ, which we have used over time, that you can actually just apply at each of those ages. You might be measuring the same construct, but you need to use a different tool. So you'll need to think about that comparability over time. It's not just a set of repeated measures. Similarly, when we're asking mostly about the children, but also their environments, we don't just repeat all the socio-demographic measures that we might want to ask of their parents, because sometimes there hasn't been enough change across the population to warrant having 5 or 10 minutes to ask the parents about their education status every single time. For example, we asked antenatally, we might have asked again at 4.5, and we might have asked again at 8. But we didn't ask at 2, and we didn't ask at 6, because the degree of change in that population of families is not enough to add 5 minutes of questions about that. So don't expect that you will see the same questions appearing every time, and there is a rationale for it, even though it might seem slightly weird. So if you're not sure, come back to us and ask. But this sort of diagram hopefully tries to explain how we make those decisions and how it has informed the data sets that you'll be able to access. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So, let's get into the 8-year, because that's kind of what we're here for. That's the broad context. Every time we think about any of the data sets, it's important to understand how this fits into the longitudinal context. You've seen on the cartoon the little green dots that tried to explain what these were. This was a hybrid data collection wave. We had a mother and a child proxy questionnaire, so we asked the mums, and they're not all biological mums at this stage. There's a whole flowchart that sits behind who is mum, and it's important that it's relational for the child. So although we're going to call it mum, there are a number of different people who will sit in that categorisation. So just watch out for that too. Anyway, the person who is in that role with the child answers the questions about themselves and their environment and their family, and answers a set of questions about the children, what we call a child proxy measure. Those are electronic questionnaires. We trialled them face to face, but mums did not have the time in their homes at 8 to have us asking them an hour or two of questions when they were trying to deal with all of the other things that go on in the homes of 8-year-olds, usually after school or on the weekend. So it's an electronic collection for that. And then here's the exciting bit, it's the child questionnaire. So the child had their own questionnaire that was done in the home in a face-to-face interview. Some of the questions were with the interviewer asking directly, others were sensitive questions that were done on tablets with the interviewer there to support if required. So that was exciting. We also had a mother-child interactive task, not for the first time. That's audio recording. Those things are still being worked through in terms of processing. There's a lot of information, as you can imagine, with around 5,000 or 6,000 of those audio recordings. So that's still being worked up. That was part of the deal as well. The measurements I've talked about, and importantly, the child time use diary, a wonderful paper booklet that we left behind after the interview for the children to fill in what they did on 2 typical days, one weekday, one weekend day. We also gave them little monitors to go out and tell us what the environment was like, so the temperature and humidity of their schools and their homes. That is a huge piece of information that has yet to be completely mined. And if anybody sitting here or online would love to come and help us mine that information, we would love to have you. It's a wealth of information that needs someone to actually just come and help us extract all of that. So far, we've just got 1 or 2 pieces out of that have been used, but there's a lot more that could be done with that. Huge amount of information in that. So the field collection itself started in June 2017 and actually ran for a little bit longer than we normally do. It went through until the beginning of 2019. It was a 2-phased approach, and that was really about logistics and planning and sort of our ability to go out to field. So I really just put this slide up to summarise the fact that there were kind of 2 phases of data collection. And this is actually talked about in the report, so you can see a bit more detail about this. The reason I put it up now is because the age of the child is quite, there's quite a range of ages of the children in this data collection wave, and that's different to the earlier data collection waves where we've had a very tight window of age around the children. Now that's not so important in middle childhood as it would have been at 2 or at 4.5, but it might be important for some of your analyses. So we give age in months, and in some cases in our report, for example, or some of the research you might want to do, you might need to adjust for age if you're concerned that some of the outcomes you're looking at, for example, may be changed between someone who is at the end of being 7 versus being nearly 10. So it's quite a range, although the median is still around 8.5. So just to be aware of that as you look at the data sets. And so just finally on the retention, you'll see if you look at the documentation that we provide, a lot of information about retention. I know this is too hard to see. It is in the report. It's also in the documentation that Avinesh is going to take you through. But this is an important diagram. It's important to look at when you're thinking about your analyses and what you are going to do and what you can do and what denominators you might have, which is a common question we often get. And I guess Avinesh is probably going to talk about this a lot, but in terms of denominators, there's not one for every data collection wave. It will depend on your research question. So we can't provide one denominator for you, but we can tell you how many people completed each component of the data collection wave, and that's what this summarises. And in the report and in the technical documentation, we certainly go into this in a lot more detail for those who completed the components of the 8-year. So 81% of the eligible cohort overall took part in the data collection wave, but when you break that down into the different components, there'll be more or less completeness for some of those children, and that is documented along with some of the socio-demographics so that you can understand potentially some of the bias that might be there in terms of attrition. So have a good look at that. If you want to ask more questions, please do. So that's kind of what I wanted to say for a beginning. Hopefully that's given you a context, and I'm going to hand over to Avinesh, who's going to take you into the more technical details of the data sets. Thanks, Avinesh.
Right, well, hello everybody. Thanks, Susan, for that wonderful context about the study. So I'm going to probably spend just about half an hour taking you through what data sets we have available, what they look like, things you should be worried about, things you should be thinking about if you are thinking of putting in an application for data access. It's important that you just keep in mind all the things that Susan has just provided context on. All of these things are available on our website in the form of our initial publications, so our cohort and retention papers, and all the Now We Are reports, which is all on our website. So there's a lot of information on our website. I'm going to do my best to summarize it. Hopefully it's thought-provoking, and you'll have some questions for us at the end. Okay, so this slide here, it's focusing on the 8-year, and it's basically telling us the information that we collected. Now, as Susan said yesterday, and today as well, the amount of information that we collected at our 8-year collection, it's the largest amount of data we've collected. So all our other data collection waves since the antenatal period, all of those combined is actually smaller than what we collected at 8-year. So in total, we have, I think somebody mentioned that yesterday, we have about over 80 million pieces of data available, and that's rapidly growing. So as you can see, we've made the mother, the child proxy, the child, and the child observation data available. That's been processed and is ready. And you can see the things that we're working on at the moment. And as Susan mentioned, the time use diaries is an immense piece of work. So we're still working on making that available. I'll come back to these in another form. I just thought very briefly, it's important that you all realize the amount of effort that goes into making all this data available. So for any data collection wave, raw data gets collected, it gets coded, it gets cleaned. We then take that and add in useful information for researchers. We merge all that together. We assign formats and labels so that it's meaningful when people look at it. We order everything around, and then we create our final data sets, making sure that all of these data sets can be linked throughout time. Okay, so I'll just move on. Okay, so this slide is intended to give you an overview of the data sets that we have in the study. Okay, so I know there are people in this workshop today who are users of our data and probably know this already. I know that there are people here who have seen parts of these data sets, and I know there are people here who haven't interacted with our data at all. And so this is intended to give you an overview of the different collection waves and the different data sets that are available in each one. And as you can see at the end, the DCW8, there's 4 data sets available, which I talked about in the previous slide. So a lot of data, okay. So you know there are a lot of data sets available. Let's think about the sources of information that are present in these data sets. Okay, so this is to help you understand what all of these data sets have in them. Okay, so we've collected information from mothers. We've collected information from partners. And at 9 months, we collected child information provided by the mothers. We also collected child information provided by the mother's partner. Throughout the waves, we've collected observations on the child, collected by the interviewer, and then we have questionnaires that have been completed by the child, especially important to remember for the 8th year. So this is how you'd think about the sources of information we have in those data sets. Okay, so we know there are a lot of data sets. We know what the sources of information are. Now, how the heck do we manage that across time, right? So, as mentioned previously, we've collected, some questions have been asked throughout the data collection waves, and some questions have been asked at different data collection waves. So at some and not at others. So take, for example, ethnicity. So if you were to ask someone their ethnicity at, say, the antenatal period, at 2 years, at 4 years, and at 8 years, you couldn't just call that variable ethnicity throughout, because then that would get really confusing, right? So this slide here shows you how we distinguish information collected throughout time. So anything that we collected in the antenatal period, you can see it has a suffix, and that's how you distinguish what data collection wave that information is from. And as you go through the waves, you can see changes from sort of antenatal mother, antenatal partner, and then all the way down to 8-year mother, 8-year child mother, 8-year child observations, and 8-year child. So this is really useful to remember. If you're doing a lot of linking across time, you will end up with all sorts of variables in your data set. Refer to this slide and the suffix to make sense of it. All of this information that I'm presenting is actually present on our website in our external data release data user guide. So there's a wealth of information in here. I'm just summarizing the bits that you need to be aware of, but please go and have a look through this document. There's a very comprehensive bit in there about tools and scales that have been used throughout all the collection waves, and the questionnaires too. These are the questionnaires. I've just got a sample here. They're all on our website. Please have a look through them as well. Right, so just to really hammer home the point, it's sort of a technical looking diagram, but this is summarizing again the data sets that we have. But the thing I want you to focus on here is how are you going to link these data sets together? Because if let's say you apply to use our data, you have a research question, chances are that you won't just be looking at answering a question, say, just at 8-year. You'll want to take something from 8-year, from 2 years, from 54 months, link them all together, find out what happened, how things have changed. So how do you do that, right? So if you look at that dotted line on the left, it says, and I don't know if you can see this, but ID and child. So the growing up in New Zealand data is child-centric, okay? So it is a child-centered study. And so all our data sets are linked with the child ID, okay? So the child ID never changes throughout time. So at 9 months, we have child number 1 ID, and that ID is present the whole way through the study. We also have mother ID, and we also have partner ID. So the point I'm making is identification keys really provide the relationships between data sets, okay? You can have child-to-child relationships throughout time. You can have child-to-mother or partner relationships. You can have mother relationships throughout time, mother to partner. So this diagram here tells you that ID and child is the key that you need to focus on when using these data sets. Okay, so I just thought I'd put this slide up to show you, once you have applied for data access and you are successful and you have been granted access and you've been onboarded, this is what you will see when you start to use the data. So arranged in data collection waves, and if you open up one of those folders, the thing on the right is what you'll see. A folder for a data dictionary. Data dictionaries are on our website as well. A folder for the data profile. Now the data profile is a summary of every single variable at each collection wave. And then data sets in various formats. So once you get into our system, this is the type of thing you'll see. Okay, so our current data release, we have 18 data sets in total in growing up in New Zealand. Things you need to think about when putting in an application is which time point is the focus, and that depends on your research question. Okay? Something that's also really important to consider is you will have missing data. Now that's just part of any longitudinal study. And if you look at our questionnaires on our website, it'll give you a really good idea of the options available for each question. Things like don't know, refuse to answer, and it'll give you a really good idea of what you think could be missing. Okay, so missing data exists at one point in time at each collection wave, and it exists across collection waves as well. So just some things to think about. Carrying on, your application, as I said, you will need to combine data sets, so linking data sets is crucial. Questions that arise from that. I've been using this data for a few years, and I still have trouble linking things together and making sense of it first time round. So it's easy to get different denominators when you do some linking. Question you need to ask yourself is, do I have the correct denominator? And again, that depends on what your research question is, right? Calculating summaries, be aware of things such as, refuse to answer, 98, 99. So things that could get you in a little bit of trouble. I'm just going to go through a little bit about the documentation available, and then I will take you through a few examples, which hopefully kind of gets you thinking about your own research questions and things you need to think about in your application. Okay, so on our website, we have our user guide, this one here. We have our questionnaires and data dictionaries, and on there, and I don't have it here with me, is our data access forms. So very important to have a look through that and make yourself familiar with the things you need to fill out. Now, as you're doing this, if you do have any questions or just need some clarification, that's the email address to send your queries to. Okay, so just what I've shown you previously, really important, again, I stress to look at our data user guide. It has some really useful information in there. And there's some very useful information about the ATIA, the structure and content of the data sets, the things I've just shown, and it has some important information on how you link across data sets. Okay, our data dictionaries. So if you look at our questionnaires, our data dictionary mimics the questionnaires very closely. Okay, so it tells you what research domain that question is from. It tells you the number, the question number corresponding to this. It tells you if there's any formats applied to it. It tells you the type of variable it is, any notes that you should be aware of. And for our ATIA data, there's a column in there that tells you the number missing and the percentage missing for each question in the ATIA. So for all 4 ATIA data sets that are available, every single variable has that information available for it. So please have a look. This is what it looks like. free for everyone to see on our website. The last two columns was what I was just talking about, the missing, very useful. Okay, so I'm just going to spend maybe 5 minutes just going through some examples with you. Okay, so the theme that, so I've got, actually have 4 examples to go through. The theme that these examples follow is, what is your research question? That's the first thing, right? The second thing you need to think about is, what data do you need to answer your research question, right? Is it at a point in time, or is it across waves? Once you've defined that, how will you link these data sets, all right? And then reminding you again that the child is the focus of the study. So ID and child is the primary linking key. Okay, let's have a look at some examples. Now, you've all seen our Now We Are 8 report. It's on our website. Have a look through it. If you don't do anything else, just have a look at that page, okay? That's a nice summary. But there's lots of useful information in there. And as Susan said yesterday, this is just the beginning. There's lots of research questions that'll flow on from here. But I thought I would just focus on 2 things on this page. The first one is the number of children who've lived in a damp or moldy home. And the second one is the number of children who are allowed to cross the road alone. And I'll show you how we've gotten these numbers, okay? And then I have a third example, which I'll get to and tell you why it's a complicated example. Okay, let's talk about the number of children allowed to cross the street alone. So that's the research question, right? That's what you want to find out. All right, great, you've defined your question. What's your data source? All right, I'm going to use the ATIA mother data, okay? Great. You've navigated to that folder, which I showed you before. You've gone to the ATIA data, you've opened it up. Now, what variable do I need? All right, I'm going to go to my data dictionary and my questionnaire and look up this variable, okay? It's called SF29. And how do I know where it's from? Well, it's got Y8M at the end of it, right? So it's ATIA mother, okay? And the question is the child allowed to cross the street alone? And the answer is, okay, all those who said yes to that question, great. Now, how do I turn that into a percentage? The bottom bit is the total number who answered that question. But hey, hang on, there's some who preferred not to say, and there's some that are missing, so I can't include those, okay? So I've done that. And now I've gotten, what was the answer? 41%. So if you do this, you will get 41%, which is the percentage of children allowed to cross the street alone, okay? Very easy example. Let's get on to a slightly more complicated one. The number of children living in a damp or moldy home, that's my research question, and I want to answer that using the ATIA data. Okay, great. Data source, ATIA mother data again. What's my variable? Okay, I have no idea, okay? I've got to go to the data dictionary, I've got to go to the questionnaire, and I've got to find this variable, all right? So this is what you'll do for your applications. I found it, it's DP43, and the question is, does your accommodation have any problems with the following: dampness or mold? Great, let's summarize that. So the answer again is all those who had a problem, yes, over the total number who responded to that question, all right? Again, we need to exclude the don't knows and missings, okay? And this is something that's really important throughout all waves, because it is a longitudinal study and we can't always get 100% response rate from everyone all the time. Great, easy. Okay, let's focus on this example. Example number 3. So this example isn't on this page. It is actually on page 137. And now I've picked this example because residential mobility was talked about quite a lot yesterday during our launch. There were some questions related to it. And there's a lot happening in this table, right? But let's say this is the sort of thing you want to produce for your research question. So I'll just maybe, if you look across the top, you've got 0 to 5. That's the number of residential moves by each, I guess, mother. And it's split by gender, it's split by child ethnicity, mother age group, and mother education. Okay, so it looks simple at first glance, but let's break it down. Okay, my research question. What does residential mobility, I forgot the words look like. What does residential mobility look like between birth and 8 years of age? So across time, okay? So let's define it. So what is residential mobility? This is something you'll have to do for your research question. It's the number of times the children's family have moved into another house since the last interview. Okay, so it's been asked at many waves. So at 8 years, it's the number of moves since the last time that question was asked. How do I know when this was asked? Okay, I need to define my data sources. So I need my 9-month data, first time it was asked. I need the 2-year data, the 54-month data, the 72-month data, and the 8-year data. These are the times that we asked that question, okay? So things are getting a little bit more complicated. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 data sources now, all right? So let's carry on. I've identified my data sources. What are the variables I need? And they'll all be different because they're all from different data sources, okay? So the naming convention is the same. It's NE, so we've got 19, but we've got it from the 9-month data. And then we've got 19A, which is from, well, it says M23M, but it's in a 2-year data set. We've got NE30 from 54 months, NE32 from the 72-month data, and NE30 from 8-year data, all right? Okay, so we've selected the data sets, but we also need to select the child gender, the child ethnicity, the mother's age group, and education information. I haven't put it in here, but which time point are you going to select these things from? Okay, they've been asked at multiple times. Something that you'll have to decide for your research question. Merge these data sets. I'm saying use mother ID. You could very easily use child ID. After you've merged it, you need to categorize these variables into moved and not moved, okay? Because that's what we want. We want to reduce this to say, yes, they moved, yes, they didn't move, okay? Once you've done that, then you can define how many times they moved, right? Then we need to think about excluding non-responses. Okay, and then we need to sum these categories, giving us a maximum of 5 moves over time. And then we need to think, all right, we've done all this. Now, is my data set correct? And so the data set in this example has 4,504 in it. If we did not exclude non-responses, well, if we included non-responses, what would the denominator be? Would it be higher or lower? Would it be correct? Do you want to include those who didn't respond? Would it make any sense? So types of things you need to think about for your research question. Okay, and very quickly, one more example. So let's say your question is, I want to know if parental gambling in the first 9 months of life is associated with health outcomes later on at 2 years and 4 years. Right? So this is a typical research question. Things that happen at this point in time, associating them with things that have happened later. Okay? And so data sources, you need mother and partner. Antenatal and 9-month, you need information related to gambling. You need to also get out your covariates, ethnicity, education, age, deprivation, income, deciding which time point you're going to focus on. You need your child proxy information, health information, and then you need things like your SDQ scale, and then for health outcomes, you need to link to hospital admission data, which we've made available in our data sets. So hopefully, going through these examples, it's showing you the kind of sort of methodology you need to apply to your questions, okay? And things you need to think about. So if you look at our application forms, there's a section in there where you have to kind of break it down in the way I've shown you. Okay, so just to wrap it up, if you go to our website, click on available data and accept the legal disclaimer. Our questionnaires, data dictionaries, and user guides are all on there, so please have a look before you write your application. Accessing the data, so this is the process which applies to everyone who wants to use our data. You're a researcher, you attend a workshop, done that, you complete an application, you send it to the data access coordinator, and I couldn't find an arrow to put a little loop in there, but we will help you to make sure that application is complete and makes sense, has all the information you need to be able to answer your question. It goes to the data access committee. The data access committee look at it and go, yep, that looks great, and then we grant you access. So at any point in this sort of flow, if you do have any questions, please send it to data access at Growing Up. Very quickly, why is data access important? Why can't we just give you all access to the data and say, here you go for it? So this is, the study is only made possible through the generosity of our parents and children, right? So we need to treat their data with the utmost respect and security. So the data access protocol is also on our website. It tells you the principles that govern data access and why. It tells you about the application process, and most importantly, it's about safeguarding the privacy of our participants, okay? So we can't just give access to anyone who wants it. We have to ensure it's done in a safe way, because that will ensure the sustainability of the project. That last bullet point, authorship and publications, please have a look at the data access protocol. It's actually really useful to know about. And to finish off, again, I'd just like to emphasize how indebted we are to the children and their families for the data they've provided us. Thank you. Oh, questions? No? Nobody? Okay, I'll start it off. Okay, go for it, yes.
So, and we had the, I think it was the housing mobility question. One of the variables at one time point was called NE19, and then at a different time point it was called NE30.
Yes, yes.
Why that would have changed?
Oh, that's actually a good question. Sorry, let me see. It's this one here? Okay, yep. Okay, so the question was, for residential mobility, we have variables at 9 months that's called NE19, and at 8 year it's called NE30. So there are variables that are asking the same thing but just have a different naming convention. And there are also variables that are asking the same thing and have the same naming conventions. So I'm not really sure why it's called NE30 in this case. I assume there was a reason when these questions were done up, but I'm not sure why it's called NE30. But as you can see, the 54-month one is also called NE30, whereas the 72 months NE32. I suppose it's a little bit confusing, but it's easy enough to know it's the same thing because of that NE. It might just be the number of components in it or something like that. Yeah. Sorry, if I could. There was another question? No.
Yeah, we have one online here. Okay. The question was, will this live stream be recorded and can it be rewatched?
Yes. So,
Sorry.
sorry, I thought that would get. So the question is, will this live stream be recorded and can it be rewatched? Yes, it will be. I've preempted some of the questions for you by having this slide up here. These are frequently asked questions, and I've only put 3 in there because I couldn't put 5 slides of questions. But these are the kinds of things I frequently get asked about. Linking data sets. So how do I merge data sets from different data collection waves? Okay? And all the various components that are associated with it. Deriving variables. So another really common one is I need to combine 2 variables that have multi-response options. How do I do that? A really good example is ethnicity, as Susan mentioned before. We have ethnicity recorded from the mum, from at many time points, and from the child as well. And so how do we use that to combine the type of ethnicity that you want for your question, or residential mobility as well? And the last question I get asked a lot, and it's probably the hardest to answer, is my data set correct? Probably, but it depends. It depends on your research question. So again, if you look at my examples and the kind of things that I just highlighted in there, that'll determine if you get to the correct data set or not, which is really, is the denominator for my data set correct?
There was one other question, and it was about, can I ask what the range of time is around the time points? 9 months, does that mean that the data were assessed exactly at 9 months?
Yes.
Yeah. So the question was, what's the range of time around the different data collection points, I think, is that right? The different data collection waves. So at 9 months, we had an ideal window of 9 months exactly in weeks plus or minus 2 weeks either side. And actually 90% or more of the data was collected within that ideal window. So that's how we designed it. At 2, it was extended to about a month either side of exactly 24 months, so 23 to 25 was the window. And again, 90% around, if not more, were collected from the children in that particular time point. Sometimes it's not possible to do that, but that's what we aim for. 4.5, similarly, I think was a month or 2 either side. We give month or weeks in measurement so that you can actually see the age of the child. It's part of the data set, and it is a really important variable. Because while we talked about it at 8, having a wide range, a wider range than we've ever had before, it is actually still something, even in that first year of life, where a month can make a big difference. And there will be some outliers, some children who either had an early or a late interview, usually for very good reasons. But mostly we've tried to have an ideal window for going to field and collecting that information. And that window changes according to the age of the children. So if you're not sure, look at the variable in the data set and then come back to it.
Yeah. So every data dictionary has a breakdown at each collection wave of the median age of the child in there, which should give you a really good idea of the window around that time point.
I think maybe just stepping back a little bit to that question, that good question about why do these look different. It probably goes back to some of the comments earlier that actually when we collect the same sort of piece of information, we don't always use the same set of questions. And over time, particularly with something like mobility, which has been much greater than we had ever anticipated, we've added additional questions in over time so that we can actually collect more information to understand what's happening. So that may be why something is 19 at one point and 30 at the other. But again, you need to go back to the questionnaires, you need to have a look and actually find out what those questions are. That prefix will always refer to that same construct, which is good, but then you will have to refer that to the questionnaire. Perhaps one thing just to add to that, Avinesh, is that the questionnaires are all available, as Avinesh has said. Please go and look at them. There is not a one-to-one match between a question in a questionnaire and a variable in a data set. Sometimes we have to ask a set of questions in the field that we then derive into one variable. So don't expect that there's necessarily a one-to-one relationship. That's particularly the case when we look at something really complicated like income. We have to do a lot of work behind the scenes to derive that variable for you so that as users you can come in and use that information without having to go through sometimes months of work to get that information out, because we have asked 9 or 10 questions sometimes in order to derive one variable that can be used in your research. So just be aware of that, and sometimes some of those things will be behind slightly different numbering or slightly different processes that mean that while you can see where they are in the questionnaire, you may not see exactly the same naming in terms of the full variable name. Nevertheless, those rules that Avinesh showed you will apply throughout. They are consistently applied throughout every data collection wave. So hopefully that helps a bit.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Susan. Yeah. So if you look in our data dictionaries, there's a notes column in there, and that notes column will tell you variables that have been collapsed to create a meaningful and useful variable, such as income. So very useful, the notes column.
Yeah.
You mentioned admin data, it's hospital admissions admin data, but do you guys provide that as well, and do you link it to
Yeah, so we get parental consent. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. So just a question about linking to hospital admission data and admin data and how we provide that for users. I think that was, yep, okay. So we, as I showed you on that earlier cartoon, we asked for parental consent first of all to link to those routine data sets, and we've done a lot of that linkage in the early years to hospital admission data. What we then do with that is create derived variables from that linkage, which we then have technical documentation that sits alongside. So there's a lot of work that goes on to prepare those variables, and then we add them to the external data set so that you can use those, again, a bit like income, in a way that has actually done all the work for you, if you like. So we don't have the capacity to just provide all of that routine data directly to you because of our relationship with the providers of that data, particularly the health data. So we do that work behind the scenes and then make those data sets available and linked in to the external data sets so you can access that information. And those things are set out in the data dictionaries and the data user guides. So you can see those pieces of work and a summary of those and the technical documentation that sits behind that will allow you to use it, and the derived variables that have been added to the data sets to help you with that. But this is where it does get quite complicated because it obviously adds in another set of data. Other than the perinatal data, which is pretty much how we created that data set, it's virtually all linked data around about the time of birth. But if you're not quite sure, that's a good time to maybe ask us a question and we can help you with that. So, and we're augmenting that all the time. It's an ongoing piece of work.
Yeah, so page 60 and 61 in the user guide tells you the process that Susan's just outlined and what's available for the linked data. Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone wanted to get involved in how you mentioned like helping sort out user data. How would one go about getting involved in that?
So the question was, if somebody wants to help us sort the data, how would you get involved? Just come and say hi. We're always open to working with people. Often, a lot of the work that is done in this space is done by some PhD students, master's students, postdocs, who want to come and be involved in this. And actually that's a really valuable thing to do because it really helps all of our users to actually have these data sets that take a lot of time and energy and resource to actually develop so that people can then use it. We're always open to those sort of suggestions, and we hope along the way that also gives those people who are doing that the opportunity to then really know the data well and ask some really important research questions and get some valuable pieces of research out of them for themselves, and also then enhance the data sets so that for everybody it becomes a really enhanced set of data and a really valuable resource that's where the technical documents come in and the derived variables often, that's how those are created. But they can be quite big pieces of work, but and do require someone who's kind of passionate about that sort of thing because it can take quite a while. Some of these are theses. They need a PhD student to come and actually just spend time, and the time use diary is an excellent example of that. There's so much there, and really would love someone who's passionate about that, about what children do in their everyday lives, who want to come along and sort of help us with that, get some valuable research out of it for themselves, but also turn it into valuable information that everybody will then have access to. So, yeah, come and say hi. Or send your friends.
So if there are any follow-up questions from this workshop, or if you just need any clarification about it, you can either just email me or at the data access email, dataaccess@growingup, and we're more than happy to help with your applications.
Yeah. All right, no more questions online. Thank you everybody for coming along today. Thanks for your interest. Thanks to those online. As Avinesh has said, thank you to Avinesh actually, and to the whole team really who have been involved in this process. It is a big job to get to this point, but we're
Yeah.
really excited about the opportunities to engage with the data sets and do all those wonderful pieces of research that we would love to do ourselves sometimes, but just don't have the time to do. So please come along and get your hands dirty and get your hands on the data sets and answer some of these questions, because ultimately that's how we start to get the research out there, get to understand how we can improve outcomes for all of our children and families, and that's really what we want to do with this data. So yeah, get in touch if you have any other questions, and just thanks so much for being online and for coming today. Hopefully that's helped you with understanding the data sets a little bit more. And yeah,
Yes,
you wanna...
yes. Just thank you again, as I said, to everyone online and here. You will be getting a very short evaluation form very shortly. So please, if you could just fill that in and return that back to us, we can figure out how to make this better.
Exactly.
And how many more to do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks
Okay.
so much.
Okay.